Hello. Yeah. All right, I'm going to finish this. I know it's 15 minutes earlier than I said I would come on, but it's my stream and I'll do what I want. Okay. Chapter 13. At promptly 3:30, Aunt Hetty rang the big bell on her desk to dismiss the class. "Don't run, leave in an orderly fashion," she called out. But this was the only time of the day when her words were in vain. The students hurried noisily out of the class, pushing and shoving as if the schoolhouse were on fire. Hetty sighed as she looked at the empty schoolroom. Then she sat down. There were, as always, papers to grade before going home. Outside the class quickly dispersed. I can't talk. Okay, outside the class quickly dispersed. Some of the girls went to play at skipping rope. Some of the boys ran to play tag. Still, others began walking slowly towards home. "Now remember," Sarah said as soon as she and Andrew were a few feet from the schoolroom door and well out of Aunt Hetty's hearing range, "this won't work unless they think they're fooling us." I'm not as good. I'm not as good at this sort of thing as you are," Andrew protested. "I'm certain you'll do fine. Now be sure Felicity and Felix see our every move. As soon as we're closer to them, you come close and show me the seeds." Andrew nodded, wondering if this well laid plan would work. "Here now," Sarah whispered as she saw Felix and Felicity walking behind them. Andrew took the little packet of seeds out of his pocket, and Sarah stood close to him. They whispered together until Felix came bounding up, with Felicity close behind. "What you got there?" Felix asked, leaning over, his face practically twitching with curiosity. Andrew quickly covered the packet with his hand. "Nothing." "I saw you. You were looking at something. What is it?" Felicity demanded. Sarah grabbed Andrew's arm. "Come on, Andrew, let's go." She suppressed her delight when Andrew, just as planned, dropped the packet of seeds on the ground and a few fell out. "What's that?" Felix asked as he bent down. Andrew quickly bent over and covered the seeds with his hand. "Do you think we'd tell you?" he replied briskly. "You think you're so smart." Felix kicked the dirt with the toe of his worn shoe. Andrew looked up, ready to meet the challenge. "Do you know why I'm so smart?" Sarah tugged on Andrew's arm harder. "Do be quiet. Don't tell them anything. It's our secret." "Why?" Felicity asked, her brow creased with a frown. Andrew opened his hands to reveal a package of magic seeds. "Because of these," he told her. Sarah stomped her foot in mock outrage. "Oh, Andrew, I knew you couldn't keep a secret." "What's that stuff?" Felicity asked, bending over as if she were going to sniff it. Andrew attempted to make his voice sound mysterious as possible. "Magic seeds." Andrew. Okay, sorry. I already read that one. Okay. "I don't believe you. They look like ordinary cucumber seeds to me." Sarah stepped between Andrew and Felicity. "That's what they are, Felicity, just ordinary cucumber seeds. It's very clever of you to realize that. There's no way we could fool you." Andrew feigned irritation and refused to budge, even when Sarah pulled on him. "Peg Bowen gave them to me the first day I arrived. She was at the station. She told me how to use them. You eat one and make a wish, any wish, and it comes true." "Andrew," Sarah said, pulling on him, "don't tell them another thing." "Peg Bowen?" Felicity's eyes grew wide. "Avonlea's Peg Bowen? The one who lives in the woods?" "The witch," Felix said almost reverently. "I don't believe you," Felicity said, though not with absolute certainty. "Fine," Sarah heaved in a deep sigh. "Fine, Andrew will. You can't. Kit talk. Fine, Andrew, will you come along? You've said quite enough. After all, these seeds were given to you. All I know, Andrew said, now feeling more confident in this, his first acting role, is that I never was smart enough to recite my 12 times table before I took this stuff. And you remember Sarah's first day of school? She didn't even know what a times table was, but sure knew them the next day, but she sure knew them the next day. I'd never heard of such a thing as magic seeds in my life, but they're magic all right. Then let me have one. I'll try it. Better yet, Felix have one. He needs to be smart more than anyone. Andrew shook his head. Mind you, you can't just take it any old way. You have to follow the directions. What directions? Asked, looking suspicious. You have to take the seed on a Friday night at exactly midnight in a church graveyard when the moon is full. Felicity screwed up her face. That's disgusting. Felix was still wide eyed. Why do you have to take it in the graveyard? He pressed. Andrew returned his mysterious tone. Because Peg Bowen said that you need the leftover life force from the dead human bones. That's creepy. Felicity lifted her head high. You wouldn't catch me believing all that hocus pocus. Me neither, Felix said, again kicking the dirt. Then, under his breath, sure wish there were such a thing. Andrew stuffed the seed package into his pocket. He shrugged and opened his hands expressively. Fine, fine, I'm sorry I even told you about it. Sarah again pulled on him, and this time Andrew followed. I told you, Andrew, now they'll probably tattle to their parents, she said in a loud voice. You can tell they're tattletales. We are not, Felix called out sullenly. Secretly, he was thinking about the magic seeds and how they could change everything. He would wish to be smart, of course, but he would also wish to get the best of Felicity, to have a new, pretty, sweet school teacher who wouldn't ever give him any homework, and he'd wish he didn't have to do more chores, that he could be rich, that he could just go into the store and have all the candy he wanted. Felix, Felicity snapped, what are you doing? Excuse me, what are you doing? Just thinking. Felicity had been thinking too. How wonderful it would be to have anything one wished for. She turned suddenly and ran up to grab Andrew's arms. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Do you think I could have some? She blinked into Andrew's eyes and smiled sweetly. She's flirting, Sarah thought with satisfaction. That's her first cousin. She's not flirting with her first cousin. For Felicity to be so nice could only mean she really wanted the seeds, that she intended to use them. Okay, she is not flirting with her first cousin. What is wrong with this author? Please, Felicity begged. Oh, all right, Andrew relented. But remember, you have to take it on a Friday night at midnight in the graveyard. Carefully, he mixed up some seeds for Felicity and Felix. If they're really magic, Felicity said with bravado, or with bravado, I think that's how you say that word, they'll work without following your silly directions. You won't catch me in any graveyard. Me neither, Felix added. Andrew again turned. Suit yourselves, he said, hurrying to catch up with Sarah. I told you how to use them. If you don't use them right, you'll just waste them. Sarah and Andrew walked on for a while, not daring to look back or say a word to each other. Then Andrew, unable to stand it a second longer, looked behind. They're gone, he said, grinning from ear to ear. Sarah turned to face him. They shook hands heartily, and then both dissolved into laughter. When they got to the road that led to Rose Cottage, They parted company. I can hardly wait till Friday, Sarah said, smiling. Me too, Andrew agreed. Sarah skipped the rest of the way to Rose Cottage. She had actually laughed and she was having fun. Of course, Felicity and Felix would be angry, but they had started it, and once she and Andrew had even the score, then perhaps things could be different. At dinner, half an hour later, Sarah looked intently into her soup while contemplating the sweet revenge she and Andrew would have on Felicity and Felix. Remembering her vow, Sarah did not speak to Aunt Hetty, and because of her silence, no one talked very much. At this particular moment, Peter, who usually ate with them, was loudly slurping his soup. Every now and again, he would kick Sarah under the table and grin. Hetty looked from one of them to the other in annoyance. They were trying to bother. They were trying to bother her, she decided. Don't slurp your soup, Peter, or you will find yourself eating in the chicken coop. She put her napkin on the table and looked harshly at him. Olivia moved uneasily. Oh, this chair, I swear. Okay. Olivia moved uneasily. Then, unable to stand the silence a minute longer, she turned to Sarah. Tell me about your school day today. Did you see Felicity? Yes, Sarah replied, not wanting to begin a conversation that might come to involve Hetty. I do hope you two will be great friends once you get to know each other. And I must get to know Andrew better. It's difficult to know him as well as I know you, of course, because he lives at the farm while you live here. Janet says he's a very serious boy, but then that shouldn't surprise anyone. His father was serious too. You know, Sarah, Andrew's father and your mother were born exactly a year apart. They were born on the same day of the same month, and they were complete opposites. Just like night and day, Mother always said. Hetty shook her head at Olivia. Don't prattle on so. If you ate as fast as you talk, you'd be finished with your soup like the rest of us. Wow, Hetty. Okay. Olivia jumped up. Oh dear, excuse me. I didn't mean to keep anyone waiting. I'll collect the dishes. The fact was, she could hardly wait to escape. I don't blame you, Olivia. Okay. Hetty looked at Sarah. Make yourself useful, she suggested firmly. Help your Aunt Olivia clear the table. Sarah stood up and began clearing the dishes from the table, but she realized too late that the soup bowls and saucers were not piled correctly, and she nearly dropped them as she put them on the sideboard. Please do be careful, Hetty said. Great-grandmother Elizabeth's china has managed to stay in the family for 3 generations. I would hate to see your carelessness put an end to its immortality. Now, could you please bring the roast to the table? Sarah lifted the heavy platter off the sideboard. Olivia bit her lower lip. Oh, Hetty, I'm sure the platter is much too heavy for her. Here, let me help you, Sarah. Sarah is perfectly capable. It has been my experience that children only learn by doing. The platter was heavy. Not only was the roast very large, but it was surrounded by vegetables and potatoes. What are potatoes vegetables? Yes, it's high time Sarah learned that to be waited on in life is the exception, not the. Oh, Sarah screamed. She had just started to lower the heavy platter to the table when the roast slipped right off into Hetty's lap. Worse yet, the platter slipped right out of her hand. It crashed to the floor and broke into 100 pieces. Rule. Hetty finished her sentence and stared at the dinner on her lap. Oh, Sarah felt for a moment as if she herself might fall over. Her face went ashen. Then she turned and ran up the stairs, tears already streaming from her eyes. She hadn't meant to drop the roast or break great grandmother's platter. She ran into her room and swung the door shut behind her. She flung herself on the bed, crying. I can't do anything right, she said aloud. Nothing. She sniffed and tried to stop crying, but the tears wouldn't stop. Nobody here in Avonlea, except maybe Aunt Olivia, really wanted her. She was a bother, a responsibility, an obligation, and now she had broken an important family heirloom. She pulled herself off the bed and went to the desk. Once she found a piece of paper and a pen, she began writing. It wasn't the first letter she'd written to her father, but it was the most desperate. Dear Papa, please, please, please come and get me and take me home. Sarah then turned abruptly at the sound of her bedroom door opening. Hetty was standing there, still wiping the gravy off her skirt with a cloth. Hetty's lips were pressed tight, but Sarah couldn't help noticing that she looked more concerned than angry. There's no use crying over spilled milk, child. Sarah's tears flowed harder than ever. I'm sorry. I really didn't mean to break great grandmother's platter. It was an accident. Hetty looked at her young niece. So like her mother, she thought. Instinctively, she wanted to hold Sarah, to tell her everything would be all right, to tell her she loved her. But she couldn't. All her life, Hetty King had fought displays of emotion. She couldn't bring herself to break the pattern now. Sarah looked into Hetty's face and thought she could almost see a smile creep around Hetty's lips. Well, I must say, I'm glad you didn't throw the roast at me on purpose, Hetty said. Then she added, although how you could be so clumsy is beyond me. Sarah looked into Hetty's eyes. I've never had to serve at the table before. The maids always did it. I'm sure they did, but you won't find maids in Avonlea. Things are different here. You don't have to tell me again, Sarah said in a near whisper as again tears filled her eyes. To you, I'm just a responsibility. She imitated the tone she'd heard in Hetty's voice the first night she'd argued with Nanny Louisa. Ah! Hetty looked as though she understood. Then she quickly said, don't talk such nonsense, child. It's true, you said so. You told Nanny Louisa, Sarah insisted. For the very first time, Hetty avoided her eyes. She sat down on the edge of the bed and shook her head. We were all very unprepared that night, and sometimes one says things that one doesn't really mean. Sarah interrupted. I don't fit in here. You can send me back. You don't have to fulfill your duty. Hetty looked up now, her voice firm. I have no intention of sending you anywhere. You are going to be here for a good while, young lady, so I suggest it's time you learn to fit in. With that, Hetty stood up and Sarah blinked at her. Hetty took the letter off the desk and read it. Then she put it down. And writing endless letters to your father won't help in the least. I don't know why you bother, since Providence knows they may never reach him. Sarah's face flushed, and she wiped the tears from her cheek. I don't care if they do or don't. I miss him, and I want my Nanny Louisa. You're much too old to need a nursemaid. She wasn't a nursemaid. She was my friend, my only friend. Hetty sat back down on the edge of the bed and looked at Sarah hard, then reached out and touched her shoulder. Sarah, there's really no need for such an outburst. Sarah shook her head. You don't understand. How could you? Haven't you ever missed someone so badly that something inside of you just seemed to shrivel up and die? Sarah's question had hit home. Hetty looked steadily at Sarah and her face softened. She blinked back her own tears. Did Sarah really know? For a moment, Sarah thought Hetty was going to cry, but Hetty looked away and she spoke. Yes, it was like that for me when your mother died, Sarah. I was 15 years older than your mother, you know. I raised her. She was more than a sister. She was like my own child. Hetty suddenly jumped up and smoothed out her skirt nervously. So, she said, attempting to cover her unusual display of emotion, when you finish your letter, if you must finish it, come downstairs. Perhaps you could read to me. We have lots of interesting books on the parlor shelves, many of which were your mother's. Sarah suddenly realized she had stopped crying. Clearly, the person Aunt Hetty was on the outside was very different from the person she was on the inside. Hetty had her bony hand on the doorknob when she turned, a rare smile on her face. By the way, great grandmother's platter wasn't one of my favorites. Chapter 14. Friday passed with agonizing slowness. Do you think they'll show up? Andrew asked as he and Sarah made their way back to the King farm after school. I'm sure they will, Sarah assured him. Andrew smirked. I'll listen for them, then I'll go out my window. I'll run all the way so I can go get ahead of them. When I pass Rose Cottage, I'll howl like a dog. Then you climb down the roof and meet me by the side of the church. We'll get to the graveyard before them. That way we can hear everything and surprise them. Sweet revenge, Sarah smiled. I can hardly wait. Now, at long last, the hour of revenge was approaching. Sarah stood fully clothed in front of her open window. She took a deep breath, or she took a deep, deep breath of air and, as she waited for Andrew. She thought about the last few days. Something had changed between her and Aunt Hetty. The night she accidentally broke the platter. She couldn't. Oh, great, there's a wasp in my window. Okay. Okay, wait. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. Aunt Hetty still ordered her about and lectured her at every opportunity. She expected a lot, and as promised, she treated her exactly as she treated the other children in school. But still, Sarah sighed. She supposed the thing that had changed was that now she knew that that Aunt Hetty really cared about her. That for all her strictness, Hetty was a real person with real feelings. Sarah learned leaned out the window and was midway through another deep breath of night air when she heard the soft knock on the door. She turned and jumped into her bed, clothes and all, and pulled the covers upright under her chin. Sarah, are you in bed, dear? Voice Olivia's inquiring voice asked softly. Yes, Aunt Olivia. Lights out now, just a minute and I'll come and tuck you in. For a moment, Olivia's footsteps retreated, but within seconds she returned, opening the door and slipping quietly into Sarah's room. Brr, it's chilly in here, Olivia said, walking over and closing the window. I was breathing in the air, Sarah explained. You were right, I can smell the ocean. Olivia smiled. I suppose it's the wind, and there's a full moon. You know, this time of year the tides are quite high, and they're especially high during a full moon. It always seems to me that during high tide the ocean smells saltier, or perhaps it's the seaweed that washes ashore. Is the moon full? Sarah asked. She was hardly able to contain herself. Olivia continued to peek out the window. Oh, yes, it is. It's a big, full harvest moon, and it's just coming out from behind the clouds. Good, Sarah said as Olivia blew out the lamp. Then, this chair. I need to get a new chair. Okay. Good, Sarah said as Olivia blew out the lamp. Then, in the half light provided by the lamp in the hall, Olivia came over to the bed and kissed Sarah on the forehead. Good night and sweet dreams. Good night, Aunt Olivia. Sarah scrunched down under her covers and waited for what seemed an eternity. Finally, she quietly got out of bed and shook herself out. She was halfway to the window when she heard more footsteps in the hall. Aunt Hetty, she murmured under her breath, and in a flash, she darted back to bed and under the heavy covers. Good night, Sarah. Hetty ventured, standing by her door. Good night, Aunt Hetty. Hetty tiptoed into the room, lamp in one hand, book in another. She set the lamp down. I found a book you might like. It was your mother's favorite. I've been looking for it for days. Aw, look who came to join me. Hey. You a good boy? You a good boy? Mm. Sarah looked at the book and Hetty held out. If she reached for it, her sleeve would show. Thank you. Could you just put it there on the table, please? Hetty put the book down and then sat on the edge of the bed. Sarah, I don't want you to think I'm a woman without sympathy. She paused, then continued. I realize how difficult. Come here. Okay. He's such a good boy. Okay. I realize how difficult it must be for you to come from such a sophisticated place such as Montreal and come to Avonlea. Oh my nose itches. He licked my nose. Okay. Suddenly, Hattie stopped and listened. Good gracious, what's that? Sarah forced herself to look wide-eyed. What? That noise, Hattie said, getting up and walking to the window. It sounded like a sick dog. Maybe it was a wolf, Sarah suggested. We don't have wolves. Hetty peered out on into the darkness, then shook her head in irritation. Must be one of the neighbor's dogs. I'll have to speak to them about that. I don't want strange animals wandering around in the middle of the night. They scare the chickens, and if the chickens are scared, they stop laying. Hetty turned away from the window and returned to Sarah's bed. She learned, I keep doing that. She leaned closer to Sarah. My goodness, you're all flushed. She put her hand on Sarah's head. And so warm. I wonder if you have a fever. I'm fine, Aunt Hetty, Sarah said as quickly as possible. Maybe we should take these blankets off. No, that's not it. I always get flushed when I'm tired. Nanny Louisa could tell you that. Hetty stood up and nodded. Well, then, you must get some sleep. We can talk another time. Hetty hesitated for a long moment. Then she touched Sarah's shoulder lightly. Good night, Sarah. Sarah looked up into her aunt's now soft eyes. Good night, Aunt Hetty, she said, truly regretting that they hadn't talked. But tonight, she reminded herself, was a night that belonged to to Felicity and Felix. As soon as Sarah heard Hetty go back downstairs, she got out of bed and ran to the window. As silently as possible, she opened it and climbed carefully out onto the gently sloping roof. She then crawled around to the back of the house and dropped almost silently onto the back porch roof. From there, it was easy to climb down the rose trellis and into the back garden. Once on the ground, Sarah began to run across the field. The moon and stars cast a light over the landscape that made it almost as bright as day. The great orange harvest moon silhouetted the tall church spire, but the church graveyard was dark. Tall old trees surrounding it and low rose bushes guarded it. Here, just enough light filtered the almost leafless skeletal trees that cast long, eerie shadows among the rows of gravestones. A light breeze whistled round the corner of the church, but it might have been the singing of ghostly spirits, Sarah thought as she crept along. Sarah, a voice hissed in the dark. Sarah almost jumped out of her skin before she realized it was Andrew. I ran all the way through the short I ran all the way through the shortcut. They'll be here any minute. He pulled Sarah down beside him and they both hid behind a huge gravestone. Sarah shivered with delight. This was the most exhilarating experience she could ever remember. She'd never been out alone at night, and she'd certainly never been in a graveyard during the full moon either. Perhaps this was really the beginning of her grand adventure. I know they're coming, Andrew said, poking her in the ribs. I thought I'd never get out, Sarah whispered. Aunt Hetty heard you howl. She said you sounded like a sick dog. Andrew smiled, then pressed his fingers on his lips. Shh! Here they come. In the darkness, Felicity, Felix, and Cecily came creeping to the graveyard. You didn't have to bring me. You could have just told me what was in the bag and where you were going. You'd have told Mama. You're just a goody two-shoes. Cecily ignored her sister. What are you going to wish for, Felicity? I was going to wish for curly hair, but now I just wish I was brave. Do you suppose the bones of the dead do give off energy like Andrew says? Shush, Felicity commanded. What was that? Felix asked, terror in his voice. He stopped walking so suddenly that Felicity and Cecily almost crushed into him. It sounded like someone breathing, Felicity said, scaring even herself. I'm scared, Cecily wailed. I want to go home before the ghosts come out. Be quiet, Felicity again ordered. She then stood up straight and carefully opened the little pouch. She put some seeds in her mouth and made a horrible face. Ick! It tastes awful! Make a wish, Felix urged. Felicity looked at the moon and trembled. I wish I were as pretty as the lady on the cover of the Family Guide. Felix screwed up his face. What kind of wish is that? Sarah had her hand over her mouth to keep from laughing, and Andrew smirked and rolled his eyes, scarcely able to contain himself. What's going on here? Out an adult voice thundered out of the darkness. Felicity, Cecily, and Felix were frozen to their spots. In the moonlight, the shadow of Constable Abner Jeffries looked like a giant. He took one long step and grabbed Andrew, who was crouched down by the gravestone to his left. Don't you move, young lady, he said harshly to Sarah, who was still by Andrew's side. Now, Abner Jeffrey announced, we'll all march single file back to Rose Cottage, where you will explain yourselves. This is all your fault, Felix, Felicity complained. My fault? I didn't even get to make my wish. I wish I had told Mother, Cecily put in. We'll march quietly, Abner Jeffries announced, in utter absolute silence. It was Aunt Hetty who answered the door. Her hair, normally worn in a tight bun, was loose and tied behind her head. They did that back then. It looked like a horse's tail. She wore a long, full red flannel nightgown, and over that a long, thick wool robe. Behind Hetty, Olivia peered out curiously. She too wore a long wool robe, but her hair was in two long braids. What in the name of Zeus is this? Hetty said crossly as she looked at her nieces and nephews. Best I come in and explain, Abner Jeffries nudged his reluctant band of prisoners forward. At that moment, Alec King drove up in his buggy. It was obvious he had dressed hurriedly because his red flannel shirt was on inside out. Reverend Leonard said I should come over right here. Alex stopped and looked at his children. What have we here? He asked harshly. He joined them at the door. Hetty and Olivia stepped aside to let Alec through, and then they all marched into the parlor. Aunt Hetty lit the lamp, and it was as if the light loosened everyone's tongue because they all began to speak at once. They threw us in manure, so we were getting even, Andrew said. And they believed the seed Peg Bowen gave us was really magic, Sarah said, smiling in spite of having been caught. I didn't, Felicity quickly countered. It's all their fault. They corrupted us. I didn't even want to come, Cecily complained. And I didn't even get my wish, Felix lamented. You dummy, you still don't understand, Felicity snapped at him. Ladies and gentlemen, Abner Jeffries said loudly above the din of accusations and explanations. If I may be allowed to speak, frankly, the Reverend Leonard was not pleased to be woken out of sound sleep by these vandals who were caught red-handed in the church graveyard with lanterns and all. I must say, Miss King, I'm quite tired of being dragged out of my bed at all hours to deal with your family's affairs. Excuse me. Hetty stared at him. It was plain to everyone who knew her that her anger was welling up inside. She fairly bristled. I'm sure you people are aware that the law forbids the desecration of church property. It's a serious offense, and one, I might add, that the law does not treat lightly, Abner Jeffries rambled. We weren't desecrating anything, Felix whined. Alex stood up. We've all been pulled from our beds, Abner. Just dispense with the formalities so we can all get some sleep, will you? Hetty stood up from the piano stool where she had been perched since they'd entered the parlor. You are quite right, Alec. This is a family matter, and Abner, it is the family that will deal with it, not the law. Now, unless you have something else to say, I suggest that you go home. I certainly wouldn't want you to miss any more sleep on our account, she said sarcastically. Abner looked from the children to Alec and then to Hetty and finally shrugged. He knew better than to argue with Hetty King. Good night, he muttered as he beat a hasty retreat. Alec King rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Come into the kitchen, Hetty. I think I've thought of the proper punishment for our band of scalawags. Hetty nodded. And you, Sarah Stanley, you go straight to bed. Alec nodded grimly. And you four wait out in the buggy, he said to Felix, Felicity, Cecily, and Andrew. Chapter 15. The mucking out section of the barn, into which Andrew and Sarah had fallen when they were tricked by Felicity and Felix, was filled with manure, chicken feathers, and hay. Raking it out and cleaning it was a smelly, dirty, very messy job. Indeed, raking it out was just the punishment Alec deemed suitable. Andrew wasn't dressed in his usual tweed knickers, but in a faded blue overalls and faded blue plaid shirt. Felix was dressed almost identically, except for the fact his overalls had a tear in the knee and he wore a red flannel shirt. Oh my god, get him new clothes! The three girls were dressed in their oldest clothes and they all wore tall, awkward rubber boots. I will never forgive Father for suggesting this as a suitable punishment, Felicity complained as she took a dainty shovel of muck and tossed it outside. We'll never finish if that's all you take in one load, Andrew complained, pitchfork in hand. Felix looked at Andrew angrily. It's all your fault. You and your magic seeds. You deserved it, Andrew returned. I wish you'd both go back to where you came from. To where you came, you know-it-alls, Felix hissed. You made it clear since the day we arrived that you wanted us to go away, Sarah looked at Felix and Felicity. Well, you made it clear you don't want to be here. We're not good enough for you, Miss Prissy. Felicity stared back. I Never said that. Sarah watched Felicity carefully and wondered if that was in fact what Felicity believed. You you two have caused trouble from the minute you arrived, Felicity accused. We have not, Andrew countered. And you're the ones who started it, Sarah pointed out. Felicity stood defiantly behind her shovel. Oh, sure, Miss High and Mighty, flouncing all around in your little lace dresses, in the air. Well, maybe that will change when your father's behind bars. Sarah's face flushed with anger. Don't you dare say that! In a temper, she threw her own shovel of muck at Felicity. I would never say such a thing about your father. Well, two can play at that. Felicity threw dirty hay at Sarah. But it's true, she thought. Had Sarah said such a thing about her father, she'd have been angry too. Stop it! Stop it! Cecily cried out. But as suddenly as she spoke, both Sarah and Felicity threw hay on her. Then, for a second, no one threw anything, but all three girls began to laugh. Say you're sorry, Sarah said to Felicity as more muck flew through the air, and then uncontrollably she began to giggle. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Now you say you're sorry. Felicity returned to shoveling into giggles herself. All right, I'm sorry too, Sarah laughed. Andrew suddenly threw hay at Felix, and Felix threw some back. In a second, they were rolling and tumbling on the floor, fighting and laughing at the same time. In the haystack, Cecily and Sarah held Felicity down and tickled her white stuffing dirty straw down her dress. Cecily and Sarah held Felicity down and tickled her while stuffing straw down her dress. Okay, wow. That was a hard sentence. Okay. I'll get you, Felicity cried out between peals of laughter. Sarah threw more straw in Felicity's face and giggled again. Never, never in her whole life had she had this kind of fun. Children! Olivia's distressed voice brought out all the actions and laughter to an abrupt stop, and for once Olivia scowled disapprovingly. Then she turned to Sarah, a distressed look on her face. Hetty just received a letter from Montreal, Sarah. And there's one for you, too. Olivia held out the letter. It's from Papa. Sarah jumped to her feet and quickly took to the letter. Its words danced in front of her eyes. What's wrong? Andrew asked with concern. Sarah looked up from her letter. My nanny Louisa has returned to England to care for her sister who's been taken ill. She isn't in Montreal to look after me. Papa says I can come home, but he doesn't know how he can care for me. It says, I miss you dreadfully, and whether you decide to return or stay, I love you always. Please have faith that we will be together soon, Papa. Or that we'll be together soon. Papa. What are you going to do? Andrew asked. He stopped short of telling her he wanted her to stay. Cecily came up to Sarah and took her hand. Please stay, Sarah. I'll cry if you go. Felicity, red-faced and dirty, shuffled her feet in the hay. She doesn't have to go. Her father said she can stay if she wants. Sarah looked at her cousins and tried to think. There was a lot to think about. Then she turned to Olivia. Can we go back to Rose Cottage now? Olivia nodded. Certainly. Then she looked at the others. I'll tell Alec and Hetty your punishment can be continued another day. Go ahead and get cleaned up. Olivia took Sarah's hand and they began walking slowly back towards Rose Cottage. Sarah, it's your decision to make, but I want you to know that I will miss you terribly if you return to Montreal. Maybe Aunt Hetty would be glad to see the end of me. I've caused her a lot of trouble, Sarah suggested. She knew that it wasn't true, but she wanted reassurance. Don't take Hetty at face value, Sarah. She isn't what she seems. You've got a natural gumption, and Hetty admires that, despite how she acts. I know she'd miss you too. Sarah looked up and realized that Olivia was crying. She stopped on the porch and hugged her tightly. Don't cry, Aunt Olivia. Please don't cry. You do remind me of your mother, Olivia said softly. She had a gumption too. Oh, Sarah, please stay. You belong here. Sarah did not say so, but in the barn, playing with her cousins, she had, for the first time in her life, felt part of a real family. A family with uncles, aunts, and children. Sarah sensed that she had been accepted, but she did not yet fully understand her cousins. She would soon come to realize that while they would tease her as they teased each other, they would close the circle and stand as a family against strangers. But for now, she knew enough. She had felt the wonderful sensation of belonging, and truth be known, her decision was made. Sarah hugged her Aunt Olivia, then broke away from her and went inside. Hetty was standing in the parlor. She cleared her throat. Well, Sarah Stanley, I suppose I'm losing a student, and a good student at that, as it turned out. Sarah lifted her eyes to her aunt's. I'm staying, she announced. I'm sure you'll want to be off as soon as Hetty stopped and looked at her niece. I said I'm staying, Sarah repeated. Hetty blinked at her, and Sarah thought she saw Hetty's eyes misting over. Are you crying? She asked in a near whisper. Hetty tossed her head and tried to look away. Of course not. I was just peeling onions. Liar. Or maybe it's the manure. Now you listen to me, Sarah Stanley. Don't you go tracking that muck all over the house. You go and get cleaned up. Then you come in here and pick up the things you left around this morning. Now remember, I will not stoop and carry for you. Sarah smiled and then suddenly hugged Aunt Hetty. I'll do my best, she promised. Then, so Hetty could not see her crying, Sarah ran outside to wash at the pump. A cool breeze rustled the wild rose bushes, and she pumped out the water and washed her face and hands. She inhaled deeply and looked towards the sea. It does smell wonderful, Mama. I think I'll like it here, she whispered, and then she smiled. Your family is all right too, Mama, as soon as you get to know them. All right, that's the end of book 1. All right, and if you didn't get to watch this live, you can watch it on Mod.